Hans Berger, a German neuroscientist who invented a really, really cool machine. This machine was the first machine that could detect electrical activity inside the brain, or our brain waves, and record it, and make a recording of it. And what was even cooler about this machine is that he figured out you could use it to tell normal brains from abnormal brains. Everybody knows what it is now. It's an electroencephalogram or an EEG. It's used all over the world all the time. Doctors use it to make diagnoses, particularly for things like epilepsy, but a lot of other things. And it's a mainstay of medicine. Well, over time, this machine caught the imagination of another scientist. And this guy was out in California, University of California, San Francisco. His name was Benjamin Libit. And he wanted to use the EEG machine not to make diagnoses or advance medicine in any way, but to answer a very, very basic but important question that had bothered philosophers for a very long time. And that question was, does free will exist? So he did the experiments, he calculated the data, he wrote it up, and at the end of the day he said, voila, I've proven it. Free will does not exist. Here's the experiment. Well, as you can imagine, this was pretty startling. I mean, does that mean that we're all just buffeted by the electrical and chemical explosions going on in our brain all the time, and we really have no control over what we're doing? And if that's the case, does that mean that even the idea of free will is just sort of like a post hoc belief imposed on us by our brains, which are really controlling everything? And if our brains are controlling everything, what does that say about our behavior? Are we really not controlling our own behavior? And if we're not controlling our own behavior, are we responsible for our behavior? And if we're not responsible for our behavior, what does that say about ethics and morals? These were all very, very big questions that scientists have been working on for quite a long time. But I think perhaps the person who really framed this problem the best was Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump said, it really was the focus of the whole movie, you know, do we have a destiny? Or are we all just floating around accidental-like on a breeze? Well, hopefully tonight, our panelists are going to be able to answer that question. Our first participant is a professor of philosophy at Florida State University. He's the author of 100 books and over 200 articles. He's the director of the Philosophy and Science of Self-Control Project. Please welcome Alfred Mealy.
Hello. You said 100 books.
Oh, I said 100 books.
10.
10 books. So next we have the president and chief scientific officer of the Allen Institute of Brain Science out in Seattle. Together with his collaborator, Francis Crick, he pioneered the scientific study of consciousness. Please welcome Christoph Koch. Also with us is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Oregon and the director of the Culture and Morality Lab. His research explores the evolutionary origins of moral behavior. Please welcome Azim Sharif. Our final participant is an associate professor at Cornell University and the director of the Early Childhood Cognition Laboratory. Her research examines the origins of social knowledge in early childhood. Please welcome Tamar Kushner. Okay, Al, you're going to take us through those experiments. You're going to show us what they were and how they proved that free will doesn't exist.
I'll start first with experiments by Benjamin Libit, and the most famous experiment, and this was the task. So you're supposed to flex your wrist whenever you want. You do this at least 40 times during a trial. And you're watching a very fast clock. It's like that one. It makes a complete revolution in about 2.5 seconds. You're hooked up to EEG, so you get readings of electrical conductivity on the scalp, changing direction toward or away from the recording locations. And you get a measurement of muscle motion, too. And when subjects were regularly reminded to be spontaneous, that is, not plan in advance when to flex, you got an EEG ramp up that would start about a little more than half a second before muscle motion. It was 550 milliseconds before muscle motion. And the average time of first reported awareness of the intention or decision or urge, or whatever, they use different terms, was about 200 milliseconds before muscle motion. And so what Libit concluded is that the brain was making decisions unconsciously about a third of a second before the person became aware of the decision that's made. Then the thought about free will was this. Well, look, if a decision isn't consciously made, then it isn't freely made. And any action that's driven by an unconscious decision isn't a free action. So, conclusion, we never act freely at all because we never decide consciously. Now, Libit did a little veto experiment. Libit actually thought that although free will never initiates an action, it can veto an intention to perform an action. And the thought was this, that once you become conscious of what you intend or what you decided, you can veto that intention or decision. He thought there was a tiny window of opportunity for this negative kind of free will. Ramachandran called it free won't, because it's canceling something. Tiny window of opportunity for it to enter, and it was about 100 milliseconds. Libit said he had two kinds of evidence for veto power. One kind was that after the experiment, a lot of subjects would say, you know, sometimes I had an urge to flex my wrist right then, and I didn't do it. I just let it ride, and I waited for the next urge, and then I flexed. And then he did what he thought of as a veto experiment. And the way that experiment worked was like this. The subjects were told, prepare to flex your wrist at a certain time on the clock, say the 9 o'clock point when that dot gets around to 9. Prepare to flex then, but don't do it. And what Libit found when he did that study was an EEG. Can we get the EEG up? It doesn't matter if we can't. I'll draw it in the air. I'm blind now, but I'll draw it in the air. It goes like that, and then it peters out about 150 to 250 milliseconds before the designated time. So Libit, there we go. So this is for the when they actually do flex. And when they don't flex, the ramp starts up a little bit earlier and it peters out before the designated time. And Libit said, look, I found evidence of veto power because we get this ramp and then it goes down and people don't flex. So now what the subjects were told to do was to prepare to flex at a certain time, but not to do it. So now it can be complicated and it can be simple. So I'm going to explain something to you in a very simple way. We'll do our own little veto experiment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to count 1, 2, 3. And what I want you to do is to prepare to flex, snap your fingers, when I get to 3, but don't do it. So you're supposed to gear up to do it, and you're really gearing up, and when I get closer to 3, you're all the way geared up, but then you don't do it, okay? So here we go. So 1, and pay attention to what's going on in your head now. 1, 2, 3. Oh, somebody screwed up. But aside from the person that screwed up, and I can't see that person for sure, none of you intended to snap your fingers when I got to 3. What you intended to do was to prepare to do it, but not do it. And just like you, that's what Libit's subjects were doing in the veto experiment. So he was hoping to save free will in this negative kind of way, veto power, and it doesn't look like that works. Now, I myself am no free will skeptic, and so I'm going to get on to the next stage of things. I won't do a critique. I do it a lot. In fact, I did it twice today because I was in 2 other sessions already today. So I've got Libit on the brain, and my free will tank is about empty. But so what I'm going to do next is talk about, very briefly, some famous dead philosophers. And we're going to do...
The best kind.
Yeah. She doesn't like philosophy. We're going to do Descartes, Hume, and Kant. So lots of famous dead philosophers wrote about free will, lots and lots, but we just wanted to pick 3. Descartes was one. Descartes thought that what he called the will was absolutely unconstrained. He was what's called a substance dualist, so he believed in a soul that is separate from anything physical, and so he was thinking of free will as the soul being in charge. Hardly any philosopher who writes about free will today, or in the last, 100 years, thinks about free will as requiring a soul or anything non-physical, but he did. And I'm going to do this fuel station analogy later, and we'll fit him into it. And then the next one was David Hume, and he had a very down-to-earth conception of free will, according to which really it was basically the ability to do what you want to do. So you want to do something, if you're able to do it, you do it freely. And you can sort of beef that one up a bit, and more recent philosophers have beefed it up. That'll be in the free will gas station too when we get to it. And then we have Immanuel Kant. There he is. He's a handsome guy. And he thought that just as people who act in the world, you had to assume that you had free will, but he couldn't figure out how you had it. So according to Kant, free will was a mystery. It was one of the mysteries of life. And he's not going to fit into the gas station because I'm not going to do diesel. I'm just going to do three grades of gas. Okay. So now we'll get on to the free will gas station, and what I'm going to do is explain to you, I'm going to describe 3 different ways you might think about free will. And I won't give you what I would call a definition, because philosophers are very precise about definitions. I'm going to give you what I think of as sufficient conditions, so that if you had this, that would be enough for free will. Okay, and we'll start with regular gas. Okay, so there's the guy. And this is the analog of one way of thinking about free will. You can think of it as regular free will. So sufficient for having free will, or actually making a free decision, is that you're sane and rational, uncompelled, well-informed, and you make a reasonable decision on the basis of good information. That's all you would need. That would be plenty to make a free decision according to this regular model of free will. And now I'm going to turn to mid-grade gas. So now some people think, well, that isn't quite enough for free will, because one thing you need is that under the very conditions where you made the choice you made, everything being the same, you could have made a different decision. And now this you need to be somewhat precise about. So one way to picture it is, what they're thinking is, if you could roll back the universe a little bit, the way you roll back something on your DVD player and then play it forward, if you could roll it back a couple of seconds and then play it forward and nothing changes right up to the moment of decision, well, although actually you decided to do one thing, like keep $20 that you saw fall out of somebody's pocket, you could have instead, under the same conditions, decided to return it. And they would require this addition. So you mix this into regular free will and you get this sort of mid-grade free will. And it's a kind of strong ability to do otherwise. It's robust in the sense that everything being the same, there's another possible scenario where you do otherwise. This doesn't have anything to do with souls or anything non-physical. That's the second. And then we're going to bump up to premium gas and the analog of premium free will. And here, what I've given you so far isn't good enough for free will, and what you need is something immaterial, like a soul that isn't reducible to anything physical, that maybe isn't bound by laws of nature and the like and can do very fancy things. So that would be premium free will. Now, I myself am really happy to talk about the regular free will or the mid-grade free will. I'm not at all a fan of premium free will. I think it's sort of an archaic idea that survives in some circles. But I myself can't take it seriously, and so I hardly ever talk about it. After talking to lots of neuroscience friends of mine, like John Dylan Haynes and Patrick Haggard and Mark Hallett, and all these guys thought, no, free will really is that third kind. You know, it's that premium kind of free will. That's what everybody means by free will. That's what they mean by it. And I thought, well, I don't mean anything like that by it. And I think, you know, I know a lot about free will. And my friends don't mean that. But I thought, well, that's just like you guys and we guys. You know, there's not much going on. So I thought what I would try to do is to figure out what most people meant by free will. And I did a lot of really simple little questionnaire kind of experiments, and I'll tell you about one. Lots of these have been done now, and they're pretty interesting, but here's one I did. So here's the cover story, and people are presented with this cover story. They read it, it's short. Scientists have finally proved that everything is physical. There's nothing non-physical. Intentions and decisions are brain states, and they're caused by other brain states, which in turn are caused by states in the external world, all the way back. And then I say, so there aren't any souls, and so on. So that's the cover story. And then we have a guy named John Jones, and he sees a $20 bill fall out of the pocket of the person in front of him, and he thinks about returning it, but he decides to keep it. It's the whole story. And, well, no, actually, then I say, just to make sure they get it. And of course, his decision was a brain state, and it was caused by other brain states, and so on. Did John have free will at the time? And over 75% of people say yes. So they're saying he has free will in this scenario, and this is a scenario that involves no souls and nothing non-physical. Now, there are, in that study, about 25% who say no, he doesn't have any. Some could think that he doesn't have any because his universe is purely physical, but some of them might just not believe in free will at all, no matter what, and that could account for part of the 25%. So I do think that the premium free will is a minority view, and I think an interesting question for science is, okay, so now we have these three different sufficient conditions for free will. Is there evidence that we have the first kind? Is there evidence that we have the second kind? Is there evidence that we have the third? Or evidence, good evidence against?
Christoph, Elvis and the Pope get in the car and drive to the gas station.
Where's this coming from?
No, this is from our earlier conversation about Catholicism and what you believed and the
We did not talk about Elvis.
Oh, okay. Well, I threw Elvis in there because I figured him and the Pope would have to negotiate this.
Was he Catholic?
No, I don't think so. How do you view choice number 3 at the gas station?
Also, I grew up in a devout Roman Catholic family, and I also went to a school, a lycée, a French lycée called René Descartes. So I had very little choice in the matter. I believe in Cartesian free will, and the idea is there's this real Christoph, the soul, floating above the waters of the brain, and when I decide to move my right hand, a la Ben Libit, then this Christoph perturbs the water of my prefrontal cortex, and that prefrontal cortex then generates all the action that ultimately leads to my raising my right hand. Yeah, so this is an experiment we did in our lab with Uri mouse. And so here's a classical Ben Libit experiment. I actually just want to show some data. So here what you have, it's a variant of Ben Libit. So here you sit and there's a tone going on at 0, and then you're supposed to move one hand, whatever hand you feel like. So you decide freely, when there's a gong, you do this or you do this, whenever you feel like. And then you record using EEG array, the data, the evoked potential, and you average. You have to average, in this case, 40 times. And then you can see clearly, you can predict quite accurately, as Al said, that's a classical Ben Libit experiment. It's now been replicated in many, many labs. You can predict, up to half a second, well, up to a second and a half before the onset of movement, you can predict. And typically, if you are a subject, doing the clock experiment, like half a second or so before. So that clearly shows this naive idea that I also agree with you, many people have, particularly if you go and ask the proverbial person on the street, many of them will say, yeah, the real me makes a decision, and then my brain acts it out. And of course, the Libit experiment profoundly contradicts that. Now, you can do a more sophisticated version of this experiment. The trouble is, why do you need to average? Well, partly you need to average because you're very far away. Right? The EEG is like looking at the bottom of the ocean, but you're on the top of the ocean, and all you see is waves, right? That's why the waves are very small and they're very noisy. So it's much better to go directly to the source of the brain, which you can do, of course, not in regular people, but in a patient. So then we work with patients that have, for reasons of epileptic remedial surgery, that have electrodes implanted. And then you can do a simple game with them. Maybe we can play this. Play. It's called the penny matching game. Very simple game. So Al, you're the patient, and I'm the experimentalist, and I tell you, So if you can tell us go, and when you say go, we raise one of our hands. And if we raise the same hand, let's see, if we both raise the right hand, your hand and this hand, then you win. And if we raise different hands, then I win $1. Okay, very simple game.
Okay.
Right? Not very complicated.
Go. Go.
I win?
Go.
I win again. Right, so in this case, I won twice and he won once. Yeah. Now you can, now remember we have EEG electrodes, well, sort of intracranial EEG electrodes in the head of the patient. So we are much closer to the generation of the actual neural signal because we don't have the intervening skull. So you get a much cleaner signal. And now you can, on single trials, in real time, on single trials with far above chance probability, you can predict, is the patient on the next trial going to move the left hand or the right hand? And this is pretty cool because now it's a real game. There's real consequences, right? The Libit experiment, there wasn't any consequence. Whether you did this or this didn't really matter. Here you win a little bit. You know, you win a little bit money or you lose a little bit money. And so once again, yes, it is true. In this case, you have access to, I would have access to your data and I can tell you what you're going to do before you know you have that. So that is indeed the classical conception of free will certainly is out. I mean,
so there's no question what precedes what.
In this case, there's no question that my conscious feeling of having initiated an action sort of follows 500 milliseconds after something in my brain. So somewhere in the catacombs of my brain, below my level of consciousness, some integrator, some integration goes up and some mechanism goes and says, now move. And this intention is then signaled 500 milliseconds later to a part of the brain that generates the feeling of agency. So this part of my brain is responsible for me feeling, okay, I raised my right hand here. It wasn't Al, it was me. I myself raised my right hand. It's called the feeling of agency. And there's a part of your brain that generates this feeling. And so in this case, yes, the conscious intention comes after the brain had initiated the action. So this really kills the premium free will gas.
So does that end the conversation?
Yes, by any conceivable notion of the non-physical soul, there just isn't any evidence for that in the brain. So I think the choices you have is now between number one, okay, and number two. All right, so now number two would be, so this is just an illustration, of course, something you've all learned many years ago, Newton's second law of motion, which is really the classical form of physical determinism. Right, what it says that if you take a system, you have an isolated system, it could be as big as the entire universe, and you specify exactly the initial position and the initial velocity of every particle in the universe, then this law, assuming classical physics holds, this law will determine for the rest of time how the particles will intervene. It completely, fully determines, right? You determine the initial condition, position and speed, everything else follows from that. This is determinism, right? And if this is true, then it cannot be true that if you're in the same exact physical position, you could have chosen otherwise. Because otherwise you would have to violate the laws of physics. And as far as we know, the laws of physics rule supreme. There's nothing you can violate. The universe is causally closed. That means anything in the universe has to happen for something else that happens in the universe. And this law, these sorts of laws says there isn't any freedom. So this would rule out number two.
Right.
Now, of course, things got a little bit more complicated because we know now since the beginning or early years of the 20th century that the best theory we have at the microscopic level is not sort of classical Newtonian, but is actually sort of quantum mechanics. The ultimate reality is a quantum mechanical wave function that sort of, the only way we can measure it is we can measure its square amplitude, and those are probabilities. So in any given situation, you can only determine the probabilities which things happen, whether particles over here, over there, goes through this slit or that slit. It's only probabilities. And this is not due to an inherent limitation of our tools. It's not true that in 20 years or in 50 years we'll have even fancier whiz-bang tools and we could eliminate this indeterminism. Indeterminism is built into the very fabric of our universe. So that means in principle now, position, what did you call it, the mid-level gas, is actually a possibility, because now if my brain in principle, if you could sort of roll back time and put my brain into the exact same position, I could have chosen otherwise. Now, however, it's still not what people, at least people of my bent that I used to be, like classical Roman Catholic libertarians, really want, because you want the soul. If the idea of sin presupposes that I had a free choice and I chose A rather than B. I choose to sin or not to sin, right? But now I'm replacing that sort of by the throwing of the quantum dice, right? That's really not what people want, but that's the world we live in. So yes, there is indeterminism. Determinism doesn't rule supreme, but it's sort of it's a noisy it's a noisy form of determinism. So here I wanted to show you the picture, but they wouldn't let me for copyright reasons. Of course, of Morpheus in Matrix, right? The iconic scene of Morpheus in the first Matrix. I assume you all know this, right? Where Morpheus sits in his leather coat with his, sunglasses. It's not clear why he wears them. And he offers Neo the choice, the red pill or the blue pill. You take one pill and you wake up tomorrow and, you won't remember this conversation. You take the other pill and you go down the rabbit hole and you don't know where it ends. And the question is, does he have the freedom to choose? And certainly it is true that he has the freedom. It is the physics of the universe doesn't fully determine what he'll do. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention is, I mentioned it already, we know now from brain surgery experiments, so these are surgery stimulation during brain surgery, open skull, this is by Itzhak Fried, or more recent study, Itzhak Fried at UCLA, or more recent study out of France, again during neurosurgery, where you can probe the brain because you have to take out a tumor or something, so during that time a neurosurgeon will probe the brain to test for so-called eloquent tissue. So what they here discovered, that there's a part of the brain, cortex, that if you stimulate, people have they feel the urge to move. It's not that they actually move, that's done in a different part of the brain, but they say, oh, I have this urge to move my tongue, but they don't actually move their tongue, but they have this urge, or I have the urge to move my hand. And so this discovery really means that whenever I feel like free, it's a complicated psychological sensation that has a neurological basis, that has several components. One component is a feeling of agency, I freely moved. The other is a component, it is ownership, it is my hand that moved. So if Al takes my hand and pulls it up, I will not have the sensation of agency, because I don't feel I did it, but I will have the sensation of ownership. It is my action. So, neuroscience has taught us quite a bit. The combination of physics and neuroscience has taught us quite a bit about the mind-body problem.
Okay. Azim.
Yes.
How does it matter if free will exists or if we just believe it exists?
Yeah, so that's the question that I've been thinking about for the past few years. When I told people that I was doing this panel, every time I told somebody I was doing this panel, the very first question was, oh, well, does free will exist? And every time I dodged the question. And I'm going to continue to dodge the question throughout this session, but I'm going to address your question. Does it matter? What happens if everybody believes, Christoph, that we don't have free will, and we live in a world where unbelief in free will reigns supreme and that affects our behaviors and thoughts? Is it going to affect them? In other words, what does a world, a post-free will belief world, look like? And I think it's an important question because scientific ideas like this one have a tendency to percolate out into public consciousness and then affect how people act and treat each other. And a lot of theorists have worried about this particular one because they worry that if we don't believe in free will, that's going to lead to some sort of moral breakdown. That free will goes, and then moral accountability goes, and then we descend into some lawless dystopia. Alternatively, there's a number of other theorists who are more optimistic about this, which is that no, it's not going to lead to this dystopia. Instead, if we give up the idea of free will, we're also going to give up our often destructive attachments to concepts like ambition and retribution. And so what a number of my social psychology colleagues and I have been testing is we've brought people into the lab and experimentally manipulated their free will beliefs, which sounds really sinister, but really what it is it's just bringing people in and exposing them to these types of arguments that free will does not exist, and then measuring their behavior. And so one of the earliest studies on this was done by Kathleen Voss and Jonathan Schooler, and what they showed is, well, if people are disabused of that idea of free will, if they're told free will does not exist, then compared to a group whose free will beliefs were disturbed, whether they were going to cheat more. And they did this by giving them a math test, and a math test that was really annoying, and it made you really tempted to cheat on the test. And what they found is that the people who were told that free will doesn't exist, they showed much higher rates of cheating, and the less you believed in free will, the more you ended up cheating. And a second study looked, instead of cheating, it looked at stealing, and you found the same thing. So people who were told that free will doesn't exist, they stole more from the experiment. A third study, which was done by other researchers, looked at aggression. So if it's the same thing, if you feel like you're not morally accountable for your actions, then why don't you aggress against somebody that you don't like? And social psychologists have this kind of strange way of measuring aggression in the lab. We can't bring participants in and actually have them hurt each other in any serious way. And so what we do is we bring two participants in and we make them dislike each other. And then we give one of them the opportunity to spike the other one's food with hot sauce. And they know that the other person does not like spicy food. So in this case, hot sauce is used as a weapon of aggression. And as you would expect, at this point, the people who were told that free will doesn't exist, they used about twice as much hot sauce. So they really gave in to their desires to aggress in this case, because why not? Now, those experiments, they give some credence to these dystopian fears that maybe we're going to see a moral breakdown. But there are some other arguably positive benefits, and these are particularly in the realm of punishment, right? So if holding yourself less morally responsible for your actions leads us to engage in moral behavior, well, maybe then holding other people less morally responsible is going to reduce our emphasis on retribution, on the type of punishment where we're just looking to make other people suffer for the transgressions that they've caused. And maybe it'll make us focus more on the punishment that actually has a social benefit, that has a utilitarian advantage in terms of making people, deterring other people from committing crimes or rehabilitating people. And so we ran a number of studies to see if that effect actually happens, and I'll mention two right now. So in the very first one, we used this kind of paradigm that we've been looking at so far. We had people come into the lab and we told some of them free will doesn't exist. We did this using a passage. This is a Nobel Prize winner and friend of Christoph's, Francis Crick. We gave them these two passages. So in the control condition, these people were just given this passage from Francis Crick's book, which was unrelated to free will. So they're coming in, they're just reading this passage. It's not talking about free will at all. But the other group, they're told, they're given this passage, which says, okay, free will does not exist. Here's a very eminent scientist telling you that. And then we wanted to measure their punitive attitudes, and in particular, their retributive punitive attitudes rather than this utilitarian form of punishment. And to do that, we gave them this vignette of this man who got in a bar fight and killed another man. And he was charged and he was convicted, and the defense and the prosecution agreed that he would go through all these particular steps which would accomplish these consequentialist goals of punishment. It would accomplish the rehabilitation. He would no longer be a threat to society, and it would serve the deterrent function. And so beyond that, we asked our participants, all that aside, how much more prison time should he get simply to make him suffer for the crime that he committed? And what we found is that the same manipulation that in the previous experiments made people cheat and steal, in this case, it made them more merciful. It made them reduce the prison sentence that they gave them by about half. So they gave half as long for this guy to suffer in prison than did the people whose free will beliefs were left undisturbed. Next, we wanted to see, well, how do these ideas really get out there in the real world? And one way they have been getting out there is that our society's been becoming more neuroliterate, right? So we've been learning more about the brain. The general public knows a lot more about the brain than they did before. And one of the primary ways that a lot of people learn about this is in the college classroom. And so what I did is I went to one of my colleagues at the University of Oregon who was teaching Introduction to Cognitive Neuroscience class. And I asked her if we can measure the punitive attitudes across the duration of the class. And so we gave students at the very first day of class, we gave them that scenario. And then we came back at the end of the class and gave them the scenario again. And so we could see that over the duration of the class, people's punitive attitudes really did decrease. People were less willing to retributively punish this guy after going 10 weeks about learning about the brain. And the students who claimed that they'd learned the most about the brain during that time were the ones who showed the greatest decrease in their punishment. We had a control condition class, which was a class on human geography where they weren't talking about the brain at all, and we didn't see any of these effects there. So what happened in this neuroscience class, I think, is really heartening as an educator for two reasons. One is that our students are learning something, which is awesome, right? Two, it's that they're applying what they're learning beyond what's actually explicitly been taught in the class. In the class, the instructor didn't talk about free will, didn't talk about moral responsibility, but what they learned about the brain, they use that to now inform their ethical decisions. And I think that's a really remarkable and beautiful thing. It heartens me also as a citizen because it's seeing up close the impact of science. It's people replacing their prior intuitions with now more scientifically grounded intuitions, and that's great. And it's especially great because those pre-scientific intuitions that we've had have caused us to do a lot of terrible things to people in the past. And so here's, if these come up, these are, okay, so there's some witches. Seeing if witches drown, that was one way we tried to figure out if they were actually witches. Here's another example. This one, in ancient civilizations all the way up to the Middle Ages, for people who we would now consider to have mental illnesses, the cutting edge assumption of what was going on was that, well, they were possessed by a demon. And the treatment for that was, well, first step is insult the demon and see if it leaves. And so you just shout insults at the demon and see if it leaves, and if that doesn't work, because why would it? Then you have to make the body as uncomfortable a host for the demon as possible. And so you do this kind of stuff, right? You torture them, right? So these are the kind of things that we used to believe and that we used to base our treatment of the mentally ill and treatment of the punitive system on. And the reason it relates to free will is because we've come a long way since we did these types of things, but what makes us think that now we have it all figured out? And it makes me wonder what kind of scientifically unjustified things are we doing now that we don't know of because we haven't yet figured them out. And that's I think, worrying. So what happened in the neuroscience class, I think was great. The question is this stuff really things that are going to change? Are we really going to change our free will beliefs? And are we going to change our punitive attitudes? And one of the big obstacles from that actually happening is this guy, or a bin Laden, or anybody who's actually attacked anyone in this room or anyone that you guys actually love. Because when we think about those people, our blood boils. We have this very strong, evolved instinct for retribution. We have this strong emotional pull to punish people. And that emotional pull is going to have to be reconciled with this intellectual idea that maybe in some philosophical sense they really don't deserve that punishment. And when you try to reconcile those things, one of them has to lose out, and it's usually going to be the intellectual one, not the emotional one. That's an insight that Nietzsche had many years ago. He believed that free will was really just an excuse that we told ourselves to justify the desire that we had to want to actually punish people. And so we ran a number of studies testing that possibility. This was led by Corey Clark, who's a postdoc at SUNY Albany. And what we did there is we wanted to see whether if we rile up this desire to punish, if we do make people's blood boil, are they going to increase their free will belief? And so one way we did this, we had two sections of a class, and we told one of them that somebody in your class cheated on the last midterm exam. And we told the other class nothing about that. And then we gave both classes a measure of free will beliefs. And what we found is that the class that had been told that there was a cheater in their midst showed higher free will beliefs. What they'd done is they had figured out that they wanted to punish this person. They had this emotional desire to punish somebody, and then they adjusted their philosophical commitments to fit that so that they could justify their desire to punish. In another study, we gave them a vignette where somebody did some immoral thing versus a vignette where somebody did something which was morally neutral. And the immoral thing that people did boiled the blood, and it actually made them more critical of these types of anti-free will arguments that we've heard, and actually made people want to defund research that's done on this topic. And that's kind of a funny example, but these have, I think, very real implications. I think this is a big reason why we tend to take some 12-year-olds and even an 11-year-old who commit crimes and try them as adults and then put them in prison for life, which can be 5, 6, 7, decades. We have really sensible reasons about diminished responsibility for why we try children who are under 16 under different rules. But when there's a particularly egregious crime, something that makes us really angry and really want to punish these people, then we let that emotional desire to punish them trample all over those rules that we had, and we throw the book at them. And I think that's sad. So what does that say about our original question of, are we headed towards this kind of lawless dystopia? Or are we headed towards a kind of a merciful, a selfless utopia? I think it adds what might be a more likely third option. So 200 years ago, Voltaire had this really great quote, which was that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. And you can see the parallel here, right? So if we actually figured out that free will did not exist, one of the very first things we might do is actually just to reinvent it. And maybe we actually already have done that.
Okay. Tamar, children and free will.
While the philosophers and the neuroscientists try to figure out what free will means and whether we have it, in the meantime, we can all agree that we feel something about our actions. We feel that they're choices. We feel that we have agency, that we can act freely. We feel that sometimes we don't feel free. We feel constrained sometimes. We feel the same way about other people's actions. In fact, imagine living in a world with all of your loved ones and not assuming that they also made choices, that they also acted autonomously, that they also were free in the same way that we are. It would be a very, very different world, and our understanding of ourselves, other people, and as Azim articulated, the responsibility that we have for our actions would be very different if we didn't have these beliefs. So one thing that we ask in our research is, where do these beliefs originate? And so if you want to know where things originate and you're a developmental psychologist, you ask the origins of us, which is children. So I wasn't going to talk about infants, but I think I will, because the story doesn't begin at age 4. I'm going to show you some beautiful examples of children talking about their choices and other people's choices. But before I do that, I want to say that all of this begins before children can even talk. So children are born into the world fascinated with two things. One is their own bodies, and quickly learning that their bodies are competent to move. So the amazing motor developments that happen in that first year are largely due to the fact that children are learning how to control their own bodies and make them move through the world. And the other is us. So they're fascinated by their caregivers, they're fascinated by their siblings, they're fascinated by humans and trying to figure out what humans are all about. And those two fascinations are the beginning of that process of understanding ourselves and other people as freely choosing beings in the world. And that's a big part of, it's a fundamental part of the human experience. And no matter what our particular definition of free will is, we all have one in mind. So that's the thing we all share. The details, maybe not so much. All right, so how do we ask children? Well, we can't ask the babies. I'm happy to answer questions about how we do ask the babies in nonverbal ways, but we can ask a 4-year-old, because 4-year-olds are capable of answering what we call counterfactual questions. In other words, they can answer a question, you just did this, could you have just chosen to do that? So they're also able of entertaining with their vivid imaginations hypotheticals. So imagine doing this. Can you just choose to do that? So we start by asking 4-year-old children about their own simple actions. So for example, we ask about things like milk and orange juice. For example, here's Sally, and Sally usually drinks milk every day, but one day she wants to do something different. She wants to drink orange juice. Can she just choose to drink orange juice, even though she usually drinks milk? Or here's Sally, she's drinking orange juice right now. Could she have just chosen to drink milk instead? And 4-year-old children are readily answering these questions. Yes, of course she could. Why not, right? But maybe more important is what they understand about the cases in which they're not free to act. So one of the things that every 4-year-old will tell you is that as much as they would love to float in a balloon over the air and look down on all the people in New York City, that isn't a choice that they can make. because it's physically impossible for you to float up in the air and never come down. Here are two kids. We can tell a story to any 4-year-old. Imagine these two kids. They really, really want to float up in the air. They want to jump up in the air, and they just want to never come down. Can they choose to do that? And the kids will tell you, nope, they can't do that. And why? Though their intuitions about physics aren't as sophisticated as yours, they'll give you some sort of an explanation about why. Some of them know about gravity, some of them don't. Not only can children reason in this way about other people's actions, but they can apply this sort of reasoning to their own actions as well. That's a very powerful demonstration, in fact, because we all think of what makes us feel free as our experience of movement. But it turns out that even though children feel that sense of I did it and ownership and authorship over their actions, they can talk about the situations in which they are free to choose and situations in which they're not. And like social psychologists, we sometimes trick children in our experiments. So let me show you an example of this in a second. A girl is in an experiment. There's 2 drawings. Our experiments are really just playing in a preschool classroom, basically. We draw things, we do puppet shows, we do fun things with children to make them excited to talk to us. And we say, can you draw one of these pictures? And in one condition, we let them draw what they want. And in another condition, we ask them to draw, and we hold their hand stuck in place so that they can't actually make the drawing that they wanted to. And then we ask them later on this counterfactual question, could you have just made the drawing that you wanted to do when I was holding your hand like that? And here's a 4-year-old explaining the impossibility of that scenario to you.
Could you have drawn the line? No. Why not?
Because it doesn't move because you got my hand very hard, so I can't still not move.
One of my favorite of these, that's a good one, but so she says, you got my hand really hard so that I could not move. Another one that I really like is because you were helping me, which is, didn't quite know how to code that one, that poor kid. So they say they give you a wide range of different explanations, but they talk about the physical constraint on their actions. In fact, children not only understand physical constraints, but they can understand mental ones as well. So is this all there is to it? Is this sort of, perhaps this is the Al's regular gas. They understand that their actions are choices as long as they're not subject to undue force. What is considered an undue force? I think that's where it gets really interesting, is that the things that 4-year-olds consider undue forces, like gravity, you can't act against gravity, you can't move your hand when someone's holding it in place, that's one thing. But 4-year-olds also consider some interesting things to be forces that limit their actions that we don't think of as forces that limit our actions. And here's an example. So in this experiment, you're going to see a child talking about a food that she thinks is really, really yummy. And then the experimenter is going to ask her whether she can choose, even though she likes it, not to eat it.
All right, now tell me something you like to eat. What's a food you think is yummy?
Noodles.
Noodles. All right. So let's say it's a bunch of noodles on a plate. And you really like eating noodles. You think it's so yummy.
Yeah.
And your parents say it's okay for you to eat the noodles or not, okay? So tell me, can you choose to not eat the noodles, or do you have to eat the noodles?
You have to eat the noodles.
Why do you have to eat the noodles?
Because it's yummy.
Because it's yummy. All right.
So this isn't a kid who says you have to do everything. This is a kid who appropriately says you can choose to drink orange juice or milk, and you cannot float up in the air, and you also have to do things that you want to do. Okay? And you remember, another interesting thing about this experiment is some of you might have noticed that the experimenter said, it's okay with mom whether you do or don't. So we have to take permissibility off the table for these kids, because if we don't do that, a lot of kids will say, mom says you can't, or mom says you have to. So we're taking that off the table because we want to know what they would do if that the piece was taken away. Nonetheless, by the time children are 6 years old, their answers are a little different.
Tell me something you like to eat. What's something you think is really delicious?
Ice
cream.
Ice cream. Right. So let's say it's a giant scoop of ice cream. Okay? And you really like to eat ice cream. You think it's yummy. Your mom and dad says it's okay for you to eat ice cream or not. Okay? So tell me, do you have to eat the ice cream, or can you choose to not eat it, even if you like it?
Choose to not eat it.
Okay, why do you think you can choose to not eat it?
Because they're not really saying you have to, not really saying you can't, but they're like giving you a choice.
Like giving you a choice, okay.
All right. So that's one change that we see in our studies, is this idea that you can choose to do things you don't want to do. You can also choose not to do things you do want to do. So in other words, this belief that we all basically share, that choosing is one thing and wanting is something else, is something that takes time to develop. And another one, equally as interesting, is that even though bad things are bad and we don't necessarily think they're right to do, they are also choices. So 4-year-olds also tend to say that you cannot choose to steal, to be unfair, to harm. Those are not choices. And as children get older, they start to understand those things are choices as well. The favorite 7-year-old response is my own. When I was trying out these experiments, she said, I can hurt his feelings, but why would I want to? That's a 7-year-old response. The 4-year-old response is simply, no way. So, because I don't study this question of do we have free will, do children have free will, is a very different question from whether children believe they have free will, which is what I'm trying to show you. There is, though, an interesting, coming back to that original question, there is maybe an interesting relationship between children's developing competency in exercising choice and, in fact, in exercising self-control. I know she wants those donuts, but she's being so good right now, right, for the apple. And their belief that they can exercise choice. And like Azim, I think that the question is more complicated than just, well, of course those 6-year-olds know they can do it. 6-year-olds have better self-control than 4-year-olds. Is that because they have better self-control than 4-year-olds, and so therefore they can talk about what they actually have, or is it perhaps the other way around? Is it perhaps the case that developing these beliefs have a function in children's lives of actually enabling them to have the kind of mindset that would allow for self-control? I can choose to do things even if I don't want to do them. Maybe one of the ways into developing ability for better and better self-control and competency and the ability to do things that we want them to do, like sit still and learn and explore the world in ways that are actually going to get them focused on their goals. So it is something that we, I think, as adults, it's a question for us as well. What's the relationship between those two things? That's okay.
Quickly, let's just run through our participants and yes or no. And I know it might not be so easy for everybody, but does free will exist?
If we go with the regular gas station model, yes. Mid-grade, I think it's unknown. Third one, I don't talk about.
Okay. Christoph.
It matters not how straight the course, how charged with punishment the scroll. I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul.
Okay.
Pass.
Pass. Okay, I knew that. I knew that.
So now I feel compelled not to answer. I think we would invent it if it didn't. I think I agree with you on that. I think we need to feel in control of our actions. Mm-hmm. I think the degree to which we need to think about free will, I don't necessarily think that we need that. And so if it turns out that you're right, and these simple experiments, simply educating people on neuroscience, and I have to think about this because I just learned about this data today. Simply educating people on neuroscience, I would say, why don't we do this with even younger people? Why don't we give even younger children that education and see if it changes anything for them? But I'm dodging the question as well, I think. Yeah.
Say that again?
I'm dodging the question as well.
I know that. I know you are.
Yeah.
That's okay. Azim, we were talking earlier that certain groups of people who believe that we have maximal free will tend to think one way, and other groups of people who don't see free will as maybe not as important think another way. Tell me about who those groups are and what the experiments show.
Sure, right. So this is one of the most reliable findings in terms of group differences in free will beliefs is that conservatives tend to believe in free will more than liberals. And you guys, this probably seems intuitive to you, right? Which is the party of personal responsibility and the party of picking yourself up by your own bootstraps versus the party of, you didn't build that, right? The social explanations for things. And I think that's an interesting difference. One of the things that we've been doing some experiments looking at this is stuff that's led by Jim Everett, who's a doctoral student at Yale. And we've been showing that when you account for the fact that conservatives tend to moralize things more, they tend to find more things wrong and want to punish things more, that accounts for the entire difference in free will beliefs. So that is to say that if you're a conservative and you find this particular social behavior to be wrong, you're going to attribute more free will to that person because you want to punish them. So it's again that cognitive dissonance thing that I was talking about before. You have your desire to punish. You have your desire to say, punish the poor for what where they are, or punish homosexuality. And what you do is then you have to say that they deserved it as a result, because that's the only way you can reconcile those
So you
beliefs.
can't say they had a choice.
You have, yeah, if you want to make these things make sense,
right,
unless you want to be very, incompatible about those beliefs.
Okay. Al, where is this, what is on the horizon in terms of science in this area?
I don't know. I mean, the Libit thing has been done and redone using different technologies, getting similar results. I'm not sure what's going to happen next in that regard. I also think, here's a point I should make too. So for the most part, aside from the matching pennies kind of study, which I think is really nice, people are arbitrarily picking among options that don't matter. And then the certain scientists will generalize from findings there to all decisions, including cases in which you do painstaking, conscious reasoning in advance of making a decision and then make it. And also, if I could say something about my own experience as a subject in a Libit-style experiment. Back in 2005, I gave a talk at the National Institutes of Health. It was to a neuroscience group, people working on motor control. And the plan was I give my talk, then I'm a subject in a Libit-style experiment, and then they take me out to dinner. And I wanted to be a naive subject, so I sat in the chair, and I was waiting for urges to flex, to arise, just to pop up. And nothing like that happened. I didn't have any urges popping up. I didn't make any decisions, didn't have any intentions to flex. And I just had questions. One question was, how do people do this? Solve the problem about when to flex, and how am I going to do it? And my decision, it was kind of a thoughtful decision, was I'm going to say now to myself at random intervals, silently, and treat that as a kind of go signal or representation of a decision. And then that's what I did.
I think you overthought the problem.
Well, maybe. But what I'm leading up to is, if I did make a free decision there, maybe it was, coming up with this strategy, this way to solve the problem, and that these little things maybe weren't free decisions. And if I hadn't been asked to report on when I made the decision, I could have just done this and talked, So I think maybe those studies are sort of looking in the wrong place.
Wait, so in the evening when they invited you to dinner, you just sat down in the restaurant and you said, I'm just going to wait for my brain to spontaneously make up the mind. I'm not going to choose, right? My brain makes up and picks the menu item that it wants, right? It's not me.
I didn't say that, no. But we had dinner.
No, you made a decision, right?
I did make a decision. Well, I don't know. It was at Mark Hallett's house. It was like this smorgasbord kind of thing. Let me remember. Yeah, I like certain foods. I don't like others. I chose. But these studies are mainly studying arbitrary picking, and a lot of decision-making isn't like that.
Christoph, where do you see the science going? What's the next sort of possible area where
Well, I
big
mean,
news could come from.
people study free will in other creatures. So there's this famous Heisenberg, who's the son of Martin Werner Heisenberg, the guy with the quantum mechanical indeterminacy relationship. He studies flies, and he puts now flies are much simpler organisms. They have 100,000 neurons compared to 86 billion in the human brain. So the question is, do they have free will, right? And so you put them in a maze. Very simple situation where, you know, they come to a decision point and they have this, they can go down either left or the right, and one is bright and the other one is dark. And then you see that you put in a population of genetically completely identical flies, you put them in there, and then you see some fraction go to the left, some fraction go to the right, some fraction will stay, and some fraction will turn back. And it's completely impossible to predict, even in these highly, highly simplified organisms, to what extent.
Are you saying Heisenberg was uncertain?
Yeah, yes. So even in a simple experiment from an external point of view, they may as well have, in fact, he cites Immanuel Kant to say, well, from an external point of view, it looks like they have free will. Some do this and some do that, and it doesn't seem to something that I as external experimentalist can predict. So there you have a very simple situation. So people are trying to study also in mice, and you know the question in a monkey: does a monkey have a free will? Does a monkey feel something when he initiates something other? And this relates to the question of self-control, right? Which people can study in animals and in humans. So I think there's a very interesting literature there to try to understand the biological basis of some of these feelings of free will and agency.
Is empathy a part of the material that you've looked at? Do people are more empathic when they think people can't help themselves? Is that what, and if you're more empathic, are you less likely to punish? Is that something that can be looked at?
No, I don't think it's empathy. I don't think that that's the mechanism by which people are being less willing to punish.
But why, how can you override your desire to punish? How does that happen?
Right, so in the cases that I talked about with the bar fight, right, these were cases where it was a dispassionate decision that you were supposed to make, right? And in that situation, you're not feeling like this guy killed your brother, and so you're okay with thinking about it rationally. And I think this is one of the good things about the justice system, is we don't let the family members of the victim decide who gets punished and what their sentence is going to be, right? We try to have a reasonably dispassionate jury to make those decisions. And so thinking rationally, thinking logically, thinking dispassionately about that can allow us to be less swayed by our emotions. But of course, lawyers often use emotions to sway things in one direction or the other. So yeah, I mean, it's about using your, trying to think rationally in a situation and not being swayed by the boiling blood.
So what do you tell? So if you ever go to Alcoholics Anonymous, right, or other sort of addiction self-help groups, so what do you tell the person who's who at some level is trying to quit, kick the habit? What do you tell them?
About free will? Am I going to tell them they don't have free will?
What are you going to tell? I mean, how are you going to help this person? You're telling them, well, it's all physics and neuroscience. You don't really have much info. I mean, what are you going to tell? Are you going to tell them it's you and only you that can make the decision to kick the habit and stop drinking? Or I've always wondered about this.
Okay, well, there's a lot of factors which are going to be involved that are actually making them want to drink. They have some self-control that you can leverage. So, as Tamar was talking about, there's this ability potentially whereby thinking that you have free will is actually going to increase your ability to exercise it. So I would tell them, if free will doesn't exist, well, fake it till you make it, right? So fake having free will, believe you have free will, and that's going to, rile up your free will, hopefully your self-control.
It's going to be little, so it doesn't exist, but pretend that it exists.
Yeah, you don't start with the first bit. I mean,
Don't
if they've already
suggest it.
read the books, then you say, okay, well, fake it then.
The better manipulation rather than a free will manipulation is a mindset manipulation. So to give people the sense that they can grow, that they can change, that they can make plans like I'm going to say now, and execute those plans. And that if they stick to that, so their long-term plans can actually help constrain their actions in the short term, which is what they need. They need to not have to make a decision every time they get near the substance that's the addictive substance for them.
Yeah, but doesn't that appeal to an autonomous agency so I think this is my reading of Kant and Spinoza, that ultimately we have to, if it didn't exist, we have to invent it. Because ultimately we have to appeal to this independent agent. You are autonomous. You
Yes.
are your master of their fate, and only you can determine to stop drinking. I think that's how Alcoholics Anonymous works.
Yeah,
Well, I
but
think that's
you do more than that. You also give them some tools to use. This is how you can stop. So it's not enough to say it's on you. You also have to say it's on you, and let me show you how easy it can be if you take it one day at a time. I went to a beautiful talk today. Steven Pinker was talking about the process of writing is the process of revision. You can't get it all down the first time. You sit down. How many times you wish you could tell your students that? You sit down, you try to get the ideas out first, but it comes out terrible prose. Then you read it out loud to yourself, then you get the prose. Then after that, you have to go and make sure that they're organized and flow with respect to each other. How many times do you rewrite a manuscript before you send it out? So you have to give people more than just, and it's for children especially, the mindset manipulations are powerful for children, especially in educational contexts, but also I think in social contexts, though they haven't been as widely studied in those. So you need more than just free will, maybe.
Does free will require human consciousness?
I don't think that every free choice has to be consciously made, but I think that if a being were not conscious of anything ever, it would not be in a position to make any free choices. And by consciousness, I don't mean anything that extends outside of the brain. I think of consciousness as a collection of brain events.
Okay.
There's a very interesting Israeli study that speaks to this. This was a study of appeal judges. Do you know this? When when prisoners appeal their sentence, and they looked retroactively. When was the last time the judges had eaten?
Yeah.
And there was this inverse correlation. The hungrier the judges were at the time, the less likely they granted clemency. Yeah, these are professional professional judges. It's a post factum study, of course. So, and this is a clearly case of if you're very hungry, you're going to decide differently when you just had a a meal and you feel much better. And so this is clearly a case of of an unconscious bias influencing us. And we're all strangers to our mind. We're all subject to these lots of unconscious biases in our decision that we don't realize.
Okay.
So if you find yourself in front of a judge, you just hope that they're well-fed and they don't believe in free will.
Yeah.
That's why PhD students to the candidacy
That's right, we bring
always
food.
bring food. For that reason, you want your committee to be good mood and not hungry.
What, if anything, would change your mind in one's belief or disbelief of free will?
So there was an interesting study recently that showed that when people have to pee, they feel like they have less free will. Yeah. So
So is
Thank
that
God
the
they-
difference between Republicans and Democrats?
So I guess, seriously, if I were to answer the question of whether I believe in free will, I would still dodge it, but I would say that functionally, I act as if there is free will. So at the very least, there's that. But there are situations in which I would try to think deeply about what that really means. If I'm in the supermarket, I don't need to be considering all these deep questions of free will. If I'm sitting on a jury, then I'm going to try to remember all the stuff that I've read about it.
Tamara, was some of the cultural differences in free will or choice. I think maybe choice is a better.
Just in our beliefs, yeah.
Our beliefs.
Wide cultural difference.
Sure. And can you explain some of that? Yeah.
Yeah, so if you look at beliefs in choice across cultures, they are widely varying. There's a beautiful work by many social psychologists showing that in particular East Asian cultures versus Western, basically American cultures, but also other Western cultures, we just tend to view more actions as choices. And we also place a higher value on making our own choices in more contexts. And when we've looked at this, we've tried to
Here in
look
the
at
United
the
States.
development of this to see at what age it comes in. And sure enough, around this age, 6, 7, 8 years old, this is when our children in the US will start to endorse choice in more and more and more contexts, the context that we're looking at, things like desires and morals and all of these sorts of things. The differences speak to the variation of beliefs about free will I think that we can have But the universals are also really clear. So really clear that we all believe in the abstract. There is such a thing called choice, and we have it. And then the contexts in which we apply that are very much dependent on the experiences we have, I think, as children. So what we're trying to do now is figure out, in as many cultures as we can, and we can't just ask our own children. We have to ask children all over the world. What they think about their lives, what they value, what they hold to be the choices that they have. And I think there's going to be a relationship between the environment that you grow up in other words, the amount of choice you actually have, and the amount of choice that you feel that you have. And that actually will have very powerful implications for kids who are growing up in a disadvantaged environments where they don't have enough choice. So the cultural differences, though, we're talking about kids across cultures who are basically middle to high SES kids who have whatever choices their culture affords for them. So these kids are doing all right no matter what. They're espousing their cultural worldviews, and they're thriving in those cultures. But then there are kids within our own culture and across the world in many cultures who aren't doing all right. And those kids may have also very, very different beliefs and choice. We haven't even begun to find and ask those kids what they think in terms of.
Are there any genetic, does this run in, is there any evidence that some of this runs in families? I mean, it could be a biological trait like any other biological
What
trait.
it would be the biological trait specifically?
To have a stronger feeling of agency or less of a feeling of agency?
Yeah,
Why
so
that would not be
feeling
the
of
case.
agency, I would imagine that, yeah. So taking that to that next level of the sort of the construction that we have, that our belief in choice and all of the things, that counterfactual reasoning and all these things, I don't know how to connect that to biology. But certainly, you do get the sense that some of us need more control than others. Some of us have early memories of feeling that way, and I'm sure that there's an interesting question about how much those differences are already at birth. We just don't know, yeah.
If there is no free will, how can you experiment to see if there is free will? Won't the outcome already be predetermined?
I went to a free will conference in Barcelona, and it was run by physicists. And one argument I heard at the conference by a physicist was this: even just doing experimentation requires having free will, because if the experimenter doesn't freely design the experiment, the results are invalid. Now, I have to say I didn't find this argument at all persuasive, but the question is like that argument flipped around backwards and twisted inside out. That's my answer.
What if,
Great.
if we begin to understand that our belief about free will has a big impact on our actions in a variety of settings, as you described? You've got utopia, dystopia, the decisions we might make about punishing someone. If everybody develops a full understanding of that, what would change in society? What would be different? Can you predict that?
No, but I can try. So I mean, this is the big debate about this utopia versus dystopia thing, and I think that there is this evidence that we might have initially, perhaps as growing pains, a bunch of immoral behavior. If that was the case, I don't think it would last very long, because I think that we would still have the consequentialist type of punishment, which would deter that type of behavior initially. So I think what's happening in these people in these experiments is they're using the fact that eminent scientists are saying that no free will exists as an excuse to do what they already wanted to do, and that might emerge for a while when people disbelieve that free will exists, but eventually there's going to be enough of a deterrent factor to stop them from doing that. So will we be permanently immoral? Probably not. Will we have a more merciful punishment system? Yes, but that's going to be very hard to design itself, right? One of the interesting concepts that there's this philosophy talked about is this concept called punishment. Which there's two meanings of that, because one is a weird sex thing, but the other thing is that people who
that's down the hall.
Yeah,
that's not
the idea is that if people were troublemakers, not by their own fault, because not if they had free will to be troublemakers, but because of unchosen factors, the confluence of all these unchosen factors, they were going to be people who commit crimes. And you couldn't rehabilitate them. So you had to incapacitate them, which is that you had to remove them from society where they would actually harm people. And so you put them somewhere else. But removing them from society is making their lives worse. And they don't really deserve to have their lives made worse if they aren't morally responsible. They shouldn't actually suffer for that situation. And so what you have to do is, instead of putting them in a punishment situation, you put them in a punishment situation where life is actually pretty good. Even though you're removed from society, you live in this really nice, opulent place where there's roller coasters and stuff. The problem, of course, with that is now you've made the deterrent factor of committing crimes go away, because now it seems like a nice thing to do. If you were to commit crimes, you can go to this place that's funded by the taxpayers and you get to ride roller coasters all day, and so then the crime might go up again. So it's really difficult to figure out what the appropriate
But there are already other legal systems that move away from the retribution, right? If you look at I was just in Norway, the Norwegian system, right? So you probably all remember several years ago, Breivik, this right-wing terrorist, killed 78 people in totally cold blood. Then he just put down the gun and was taken prisoner, and he was declared sane, and he's locked up for 20 years. And it's really under the idea we need to protect ourselves at least for the next 20 years from him, rather than the boiling blood. So there are already some societies that are beginning to move towards a more sort of away from the idea of purely punishment as retribution.
Sure, absolutely. I
So
think
that is hopeful.
absolutely. There's a balance to be struck, and I think that the United States is pretty far on one side of the spectrum here in terms of balancing retribution and consequentialist advantages. Yeah.
30 seconds for each person. Tamar, is there any sort of wrap-up thought you'd want to leave the audience with tonight? Okay.
I'll conclude with the last two sentences of my book, Effective Intentions. Don't worry, be happy.
Don't stop imagining possibilities, and you won't stop seeing choices.
Okay. You're going to pass on this
I don't
too?
think I can top that. I mean,
Yeah, no, that's tough.
I
My
think
new best friend.
No, I think there is value, whether this question of free will is resolved scientifically or not. I think there is value in replacing these pre-scientific intuitions with things that are more scientifically grounded. It'll allow us to be a more scientifically justifiable society in terms of how we punish people.
Okay, excellent. Thank you to Al, Christoph, Azim, Tamar.